there are two types of filters. We are the classical analog modeled type of filters, what we call IIR filters. And then we have the linear phase digital type of filters called FIR. This is linked to the model that is used to create them. IIR, the analog type of filters, there is a shift in the phase, but they don't have what we call pre-ringing. I'm going to show you what pre-ringing is doing. There is low latency because there's not so much processing happening, but it's tilting, it's changing the phase of the different frequencies depending on the curve of the filter. FIR filter, they are using a kind of convolution technique, a snapshot of the sound, and there is no phase shift if the linear phase mode is used. But in order to maintain the phase relationship of every frequency, it's moving things through time at some multiples of the phase, hence creating pre-ringing and smearing the transients. Also, because of all this processing, there is higher latency, so this can't be used for a live application. There's always a delay, a latency added because of the processing. All right, let me show you what I mean with pre-ringing and the effect of linear phase filtering pre-ringing on an audio signal. If I'm to play this kick drum without any EQ, okay, this kick drum is playing properly, there is no EQ turned on. Now I'm adding a low cut with a kind of boost. Still clean, right? With. The tone is changing, but we keep the impact. Now I'm dialing linear phase, I'm putting it to maximum so we hear the strongest effect. Listen what's happening. You hear this kind of whoosh happening before. I can even show it to you. I'll make a new track. See the difference? This thing here. Vroom. This is because normally this cut is changing the phase of the low end content, but in order to keep the phase consistent, it's moving every frequency there that is shifting by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cycles of that frequency, so they are still aligned, hence having this low end wobble happening now before is the pre-ringing. And as you hear, this pre-ringing is clearly heavily messing up the transients. You lose the punch, you lose the impact. Of course, this is a heavy setting. If I would play the same kick drum with a more gentle, less resonance, and if the cue is less strong and I have lesser demand on the linearity of phase, if I allow a bit of phase shift, then we're getting something in between. If I was to record this, now we see there's just that little thing before. It's not that bad, right? I can live with that. But now we see the impact of linear phase on pre-ringing, and this is the reason why most of the time I don't use linear phase EQs even in mastering context on the low end. In the mid-range, it's okay, it can be more gentle. Of course, the stronger the low cut, the higher the pole, the more decibel per octave you have, the stronger the effect will be. Then here again, if you can get rid of a low cut filter and just use a low shelf, you could get similar effect, but with less. There is a little pre-ringing, but less strong than the first example we had here, where there was a lot of shit happening before. This is also why most of the mixers are using traditional analog modeled filters, and that the linear phase type of filters are more used for mastering, or exceptionally in the case of touching a low end in a mix where two elements are playing low end content in a proper way, that the phase of the two sounds are actually aligned, and you don't want to mess with that. And this is a very important aspect. When you see so many people telling you that you shouldn't low cut your bass or low cut your kick because it's shifting the phase, this is absolute bullshit. Why? Because phase shifting per se is not a problem. What is a problem is when you are shifting the phase of two elements playing in the low end that are properly phase aligned. And while shifting one, you start to misalign it to the other one, and then instead of working together and have a constructive interference, they have a destructive interference, and one sub frequency of one of the sounds starts to cancel the frequency of the other one because they are kind of polarity shifted. So if you really need to tweak the low end of two elements that are properly aligned, then you might either use linear phase filters or use shelf filters. Personally, I don't like so much linear phase because of the pre-ringing. I feel it's taking out a lot of punch and presence of a sound. This being said, you can also have two elements playing in the low end that are not properly aligned, and actually putting on a low cut filter will help you solve that problem because it will shift the phase in order to make them right. Even further, we have all pass filters that are tilting the phase, and in fact sometimes this is what you need to properly align a kick and a bass to have them working very nicely together. Phase shifting, it's always depending on the context, and if you have just one element playing in one frequency range, there will never be a clash because it's alone. If you have just a big 808 playing and no bass line, you don't give a damn about phase shifting, except if the shifting is then inducing higher peaks, right? So here again, you start to understand that phase is not a bad thing. It's just there, and it's the relationship between elements and their phase relationship that can be constructive or destructive. I'm going to show you something. So what did I do? I have a first kick on channel 1, and I have a bass line on channel 2. As you can see, I have this oscilloscope. Oscilloscope is showing in green the kick and in white the bass line. And as you can see and as you can hear, when the two are playing together, at the end of the kick, the low end is disappearing. Without the bass, with the bass. Because, as you can see, the frequency of the kick and the bass that are kind of the same start to pile up in a destructive way. They are like polarity flipped. As soon as I turn on the filter on the bass, look what's happening. We have the low end coming back. So in this particular example, we see that actually filtering the low end was a trick that was helping to get more low end because we're getting better phase consistency between the two elements. If I now find that the whole track is having too much or too little low end, then it might be beneficial if I want to adjust the kick and the bass, well, to group them together and to apply the same EQ on both of them, because any EQ move that I will do will change this relationship. For example, if I'm going back to the kick and I'm adding some EQ, low shelf are a bit lesser aggressive. Let's say I want to remove some low end with the shelf on the kick. You see this is changing just a little bit. They are drifting a little bit apart, but this is not so much an issue. But as I said, if I felt, for example, that I didn't want to add this low cut on my bass line that was making them working together, I could also dial in an all pass filter. Let's do that. Let's go for a Pro Q4, and if you looked, I was at around 36 Hertz. So I'm going to go into this area and I'm going to call for an all pass filter. And let's now have a look. Now let's move this filter. I can move my all pass filter and I can adjust the phase relationship of the kick and the bass without altering the sound of the bass. If I was to play the bass alone, let's listen to the bass. If I take out the filter, it's not changing anything on the sound of the bass line, but it's changing the phase relationship between my kick and my bass.